So today we are going to talk about empathy, which is one of the other courses that you developed with us. So shall we get started really with, seeing as you're an academic, with some definitions around empathy?
Sure. Well, I'm an academic, but also a philosopher, and like that's our life. You know, we always think like, how are you defining it? And so I really thought I started this I thought about empathy quite a bit, but really it wasn't until 2011 I started thinking about writing about it. And then 11 years later, I had the book. So the first question is, to me, is like, what is empathy? So I start reading everything in psychology, neuroscience. There's a whole bunch of different collection of essays from people from different disciplines. And that didn't really satisfy because I saw this difference in understanding. Like, for instance, contemporary understanding of empathy is either it's cognitive or affective, or three types, like emotional, cognitive, something else. Or people define it as caring for someone, or making a connection. And we have people called empaths right? This is something where more of the catching of another emotions or feelings is hard to control, right? This is why we can't just say empathy, always. We have to think about context. So anyway, after I was thoroughly confused, I started looking back in the whole history of the word, like an etymology of it. And I found that our contemporary word for empathy comes from a German word, Einfühlung, which started really with Herder. If you want to read a good synopsis of that, you can read Isaiah Berlin's work on Herder. He mentions it over and over. And the basic idea was for Herder in the late 1700s is, look, people are thinking about other cultures in a very strange way because they have this unilinear theory of history. So Herder said we have to feel into the experiences of other cultures to be able to understand them from the inside. And that's where I see, it had antecedents in Greek thought, but not much. It's more around the word pathos. But as with Herder, we see this notion of feeling into. And then, this won't take too long, but and then I saw in the 1800s, there was a shift where Einfühlung meant more, how do we understand artistic objects? So we project our thoughts into objects of art to try to understand them. And that's where Einfühlung went. Then in the 20th century, we have a shift from that. And that's when we start hearing empathy about people, right? Starting with psychologists and phenomenologists in the early 20th century. The idea was, okay, how can I feel with my patients, right? Freud writes about this, and others. Theodore Lipps, right, is the one who took Einfühlung and made it into psychology, right? And then after that, you have a whole bunch of different hosts of understandings associated with care, with caregiving. So that's quite different. So in any case, my theory is that empathy really has to do with all three of these movements, where there's an awareness and mindfulness of some situation or a person's thoughts. There is a sense of being with or connected or not. And there's the aspect of care, like caring for somebody. And that one is pretty well established after like 1940s with early childhood studies. We see that the notion of empathy is care. So that's my idea. I'm not the word police, though. People can think about it as they will, but I think we have some responsibility here to pay attention to what has happened historically, and then see how we got to this point. Because, if you're going to go through and look for definitions of empathy, you'll probably find like 100. I found 120 in the different ones,
Didn't realize we started with such a big question.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, so that's the thing. People are going to have different understandings. So if we're talking about common ones today, some people think about it as connection, like empathic connections. Others think about it as walking in the shoes, right, of others, or imagining the perspective of another. And some people talk about empathic inference. Others talk about, again, empathic concern. So with all of this, the goal is, again, people can have different understandings and different notions. My thought is all those work. So that's the theory I was trying to include all the definitions rather than exclude them. Because, when you start talking about it, a scholar can just say, hey, I have these notions of empathy, but I'm not talking about that. I'm going to speak with that. right? So my work tried to just combine all the different ones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we see in the basic guide. It's not so long-winded in the course, so don't worry about it. But in our course we created, it's much more to the point, but I think that's the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And we've actually had a question just in from Abhijit, and they have asked, in your opinion, Mark, please clarify what is the difference between empathy and a broad sense of compassion?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and it's a really long one. And I want to say it first, whatever I'm going to say right now, it's not like the final answer that I want to give. But if we look at each of these words, they have histories, right? So passion is actually connected with pathy, empathy, and compassion. And those are both derived from Greek notions of pathos. Mm-hmm. And pathos meant different things to the ancients. For Hippocrates, it meant that a pathogen or a pathology is something wrong in the body, where Stoics talked about pathos as being moved by things you shouldn't be concerned about, right? So out of that history arises different uses of the term. So in general, I think of the difference between these two as interconnected, right? I don't see them as totally separate, but I do think compassion would be more of a focused on not just caring about someone else's suffering, but also doing something, right? People can say, I have compassion, but I got to go do something, So I think compassion definitely involves a caring for the suffering of others and actually doing something about it, trying to relieve the suffering, where empathy, as I've already said, has a much broader sense and is used in so many different terms. And I define it the way I've defined it. But again, like I'm saying, it's kind of silly. Like I would never be like, we must define it this way. It's just a strange thing to do to these concepts. But I think that's how I would talk about the distinction. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. And why do you think that empathy is so important in the workplace today?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the first reasons is that people want to feel at their job welcome. They want to feel confirmed in their work. They want to feel welcome. They want to feel like they belong. So a sense of belonging is important, especially for leaders to show empathy, because we know for a fact that people don't really leave their jobs. They leave their bosses. They usually leave unhealthy workplace environments. And so when people leave unhealthy workplace environments, there's consequences to that, right? And one of them is turnover rates for a company. That's very costly. Just in the healthcare, I think, and I'm just trying to remember some things I read. There's some quotes that for every nurse that quits, it costs $25,000 to train another. And I've heard it as high as $110,000. So that's important. Also, if you stay in the medical field, there's this thing called HCAHPS in the United States. And it's basically, not everybody agrees to its value, but it still functions for something important. The HCAHPS is a test, or like a series of questions hospitals have to ask their patients upon leaving. And basically, it's just the questions. I mean, besides the demographic questions, it's all about did your doctor or nurse care for you, right? And they didn't use the word empathy, but it's basically around caregiving. Were they listening to you? So all those things that make up empathic senses. Now those HCAHPS scores are raised significantly with doctors who show empathy. The scores go up. And I think it's also that the doctors who have high scores on the HCAHPS get sued 100% or so less than those in the bottom third.
Wow.
But these are a lot of really big facts that are just more explicit of like, how do you build a culture that's going to be healthy, that people are working together, where there's innovation, right? It's hard to have innovation if you don't feel free to create, if you don't feel like your work is being valued, and those sorts of things. So I think that's just a short answer for a couple of really good reasons. I think, like, when I was younger, I would just want to lay on the beach all day. I didn't want to do anything. You get older, you start realizing, like, you really want to have meaningful work, right? And it's tough to have meaningful work if you don't feel valued or free to be creative, and that you're heard. Being heard is a big thing. And part of the process of growth is being heard by others and them helping you figure out what to do. So that just seems pretty obvious to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely. And do you have any tips for how people can develop and demonstrate empathy towards their colleagues in the workplace?
Yes. Well, based on what I just said, a couple things. First of all, I'd say real active listening.
Mm.
So I have to really work on this because in my mind, I'm already thinking about what to say. So I have to quiet my mind a bit and really listen and let it sink in what people are saying. And then with active listening, it also helps to repeat back what you've heard for the person understanding that they're heard. Now, contextually, this can happen. It may be required more beneficial in certain circumstances rather than others. But I think that with active listening, that's a first step. Another way I think of showing empathy is, and I have a list in my book, so I can't recall what I wrote, but I would say there's something I call the art of appreciation, right? People, again, want to be welcome. They also want to feel valued. Appreciating someone's work, even if it's a small note to say thanks or just encouraging them during a meeting, right? Appreciation is good. Also, I guess on the other side is, if you're thinking about empathy as perspective taking, you want to try to really understand where someone's coming from. So beyond just the listening, you want to make sure to grasp and understand where another person might be coming from. And all of that goes back to, a sense of being mindful, all of these things, being aware, paying attention, right? This first step of empathy is usually left out because we usually think about, walking in another person's shoes or taking their perspective. Well, you might want to observe it first and be mindful, right? And listen to the person. So those are all really good steps. I think also I would say another way is to make careful judgments about how much empathy you show in relationship to being a professional, right? Or different sorts of things. So in a professional setting, there could be ways in which your actions or thoughts or words can be misconstrued. So that's a whole nother thing involving more critical thinking skills involved with that as well. And the last thing to say is, I guess, to really be mindful of how you are seeing the world. So people call this self-empathy, right? Do you know yourself? Do you know the way you're perceiving the world? Do you know what you're overlooking? Those sorts of things. So self-empathy is very important as well.
So is self-empathy like self-awareness?
Yes, it's a self-empathy. It's also a type of self-love that writers like Bell Hooks talks about. A type of self-love, but also a self-understanding of your limits too. There's an ancient Greek notion of sophrosne, and that is self-knowledge. And what that means is knowing who you are and who you are not, what you can do and what you cannot do. And so, those things are always changing. So it has to be a continual process of looking inward, understanding yourself, your role, your potential, and then knowing the line between, I can just tell you one case, kind of a self-deprecating. When I was in junior high, I played basketball and I was pretty good. And I was 5'8", right? And then I wanted to be a basketball player, but I just realized I'm not growing much more and it's not going to work. So I had to know myself better because, you realize a realistic picture, at least in those cases where there's no way I could have ever done it. So this is a process we always have to undertake. It's always there for us, always thinking about what I can do in my life, what should I do in my life, and how do I reach certain goals in relationships to others? And really just the self-love self-love. I think there's too much in at least American society of people not having problems with their body image or whatever it might be. And, a lot of that's just fueled by capitalistic interests to make people have, sell them something, love yourself, be kind to yourself. Those sorts of things are good, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And you spoke about empathy in terms of professionalism as well. And that was actually something that I was going to ask you, is that how difficult do you think it is to balance empathy in the workplace with professionalism in the workplace and also efficiency in the workplace as well?
Sure. Well, again, it goes back to the issue of how you're thinking about empathy. So I'll just go with my way of thinking about it. I think empathy involves a certain sort of mindfulness and awareness of situations combined with the attempt to get or understand the situation or another person and caring for that person. So all those things in a professional setting require a certain amount of discernment. It's not a word we hear too much, but making judgments and having discernment as to what amount of empathy is appropriate. Now that's an act of discernment, and that's very difficult, right? But if you're thinking that way and thinking like in terms of empathy, then you should be able to figure that out. But you can't really have a definitive answer to that because of the acts of discernment that are required. But in general, I think there's a lot of things where people can need, if they're practicing empathy and they're in the workplace and they feel as though it's not working or it's not being received well, then there's a need to adjust, right, the amount of empathy, especially in the workplace. But for leaders especially, I think that it's so key for leaders to show empathy to their workers and other people working for them, because it really can motivate. It can change someone's whole dynamic. There's nothing worse than being at work and feeling like you're not cared for or people don't get you, right? Don't understand. So I guess that would be the short answer. That's something it takes a little bit more thought, I think, to give a more fully flushed answer, but I'd say discernment is key. So just think about that in terms of one's own life.
I think it's interesting what you said about how people like to feel like they belong, like to feel like they're valued. And I think that I have noticed that that's an increasing trend in the workplace as well, is that it's becoming increasingly important to generations that are coming through. So people especially talk about how with Gen Z, it's really important that their values align with a company. And so it's also interesting looking at it from the company perspective that they also need to start, I was about to say caring. Obviously that's one definition of empathy, but about the whole person, not just the person who is doing the work, but like everything about that person. What are some common mistakes that people make when trying to practice empathy? So you kind of alluded to that there's perhaps such thing as too much empathy, or when the empathy isn't landing very well.
Yeah, so could you say the question again? I'm sorry, it was...
sorry, so it's quite a convoluted question there. So fine. Can you share a kind of common mistakes that people make when trying to practice empathy? So if, for example, one of those mistakes might be kind of overdoing it and coming across as overbearing, for example.
Yeah, I think that would be it. We have to be careful about saying like showing empathy would be a mistake. But yeah, I think in those cases, right? Sometimes if you're in a workplace and it's not landing, as you said, which is nicely put, then it might be time for a change if you're not feeling welcomed, if you're not feeling valued. But I think that it's always a good thing to do, just to come up to somebody, hey, I heard about what's going on. Are you doing all right? Just small things like that. It shows you care. You're trying to understand, you're reaching out, and that's important. So I don't want to think that that's too much of a dangerous thing. Clearly if I'm like, if somebody is like in the workplace and the person's attached and I'm sending the person all these empathy, then that would be too much. I mean, right? So these sorts of things, again, going back to discernment, but I think it's always good to have a balanced sense of just reaching out to people and trying to get their perspective on things. You know, you can think of like a meeting, like if someone's, you know, if there's people in the meeting and they're not all in sort of a democratic way contributing, I mean, what are they there for? If they're not, they can't, right? So I think it's really important to encourage people to ask what they think, like for someone running a meeting, like, what do you think about this? And take it seriously. That could make so much of a difference. And again, all those statistics about turnovers and lawsuits, those are real. And not only that, for healthcare, the HCAP scores are really part of a calculus that gets each hospital 3% returns from reimbursements. So this is in healthcare, it's really big. So if you score very low on these HCAP scores, it can, obviously, the stats show that there's more lawsuits. I mean, if a doctor cares for you and is understanding you and communicates with you, that doctor is less likely to be sued during malpractice, just less likely. And then again, with the whole company, the whole hospital getting 3% of their costs back from the government. It was part of the Obamacare, and it'll probably go beyond 3%. So I think those are just beneficial things, like widespread empathy in organizations, just beneficial. And there's just so many statistics that show. And I'm a philosopher, so I'm like, when I read studies, I'm usually like wrong, and I criticize the methods. But these are really good studies, and it definitely should be looked at, especially for anyone in healthcare or any sort of company, if they want to exceed their bottom line goals. I think that it really contributes to that.
It's interesting that as you're speaking, there's a lot of like the themes that you said at the start with the definitions coming out. Like I'm seeing a lot of parallels with when people talk about like DE&I initiatives and having like inclusive workplaces, and empathy seems really closely tied with that as well. Could you share any specific strategies that people can use to promote empathy in their workplace?
Well, I mean, one thing is just maybe just talking about it or putting it into one's codes of ethics. I know some places, some institutions they actually say as part of their code of ethics or part of the way they are as an institution, of empathy being very important, right? Being empathic to others. And then if there's any certain strategies, I would say this. There's one thing that some social science studies has shown is that when we often think of ethics and morality as sort of like holding the right principles or following the rules or standards. Now, those are important because they help us to distinguish what not to do and what to do. But what really matters is habit. Habits are in the body. They are processes in the mind, right? It's not just some principle, abstract principle out there that I have to now match my behavior to out there. That just seems strange. Habits, Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. So I know that was a lot like, how does it have to do with your question? Here's the answer. Well, if you want a strategy, start doing it today. Start practicing it. Just look around, try to be more mindful. Get the empathy in the workplace course and look at the strategies there, just as much as you like. And it's just a matter of doing it, right? It's one thing to say, a person can say, well, I am this way, but unless they do it, it's nothing. And the repetition of it, being mindful, being aware, the repetition of trying to understand someone's perspective, the repetition of being concerned for another person's well-being, that repetition will make you into more of an empathic person, because habits of mind and body are what create our characters.
Oh, I love that quote at the end there, Mark.
Feel free to quote me anyway.
So it's like intrinsic to culture, and that starts with acting these things out.
Yes. Yeah. Instead of just thinking like I am this way and I've got the right principle, you can imagine someone saying, I hold this principle, never harm anyone. right? And then you could go out to lunch with someone who holds the same principle. And because it's so abstract, like that person might be a vegetarian, I might be a meat eater. And like, they're like, what? You said harm? You don't harm people? Well, that's because I base my life on a principle that's extremely abstract. But again, but habits are in the act of doing. So there's no abstraction to it. It is just within the body. And the more we do it, the more we do it, the more we become. And I tell my students this all the time because it really is true. I've seen it happen in my own life. I've seen it happen with students. When you act, when you do, you become, right? You become that out of repetition.
Mm-hmm. So it's those actions in everyday life.
Yes. Yeah. That's the best strategy. Just do it. It's like the old Nike commercial. Yeah.
So we touched on at the start about your interest in philosophy of technology. And obviously we have worked together on courses which incorporate VR technology and AI technology. So could you share how you first got into VR and XR in education?
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I know AI is probably going to come up in this conversation eventually, so that'll be fun. But I have a lot of thoughts about that. But yeah, so here's the thing. In philosophy, you go into a philosophy class, especially an ethics class, and then you learn about all these theories like consequentialism, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, deontology. And they're all really good, but they're ideas, right? And then in philosophy also, you have these things called thought experiments. Have you ever heard of the trolley car example? It was in that show, the movie, The Good Place, the TV show. But anyway, it's a scenario in real short or quickly. It's a train coming down a track and you can control the train to move on a track that has only one person. But if you do nothing, you'll hit 5 people. So that's called a thought experiment. So imagine you're in an ethics class and you're like, oh, let's do this thought experiment. Yay, okay. Now you leave class and you forget everything because you didn't do anything. There was no habits again, right? So you just leave and you go to get a burrito and you're like, oh, what? And then, later, like, what did we study? So I saw that in philosophy with these thought experiments and this notion of ideas of ethics. And I thought, like, we got to make it more real. And before VR came out, it was really just role-playing events and then people telling people to have habits. But, we're in a position now where we can create some amazing simulations of scenarios. And, like the one we have, where we are trying to create and even create decision trees where there's different consequences. So instead of just talking about ethics and the ideas and thought experiments, I thought, well, I've got to get into this technology. I got to figure out ways to be creative, to really have someone feel, right? Everything with ethics and philosophy and ideas, it's not just here, it's a body. It's in the whole body. So if I think about the trolley car and I don't have a visceral feeling and I'm not embodied, what's the work? What's the value of that? So with VR, you can be placed in a situation where you never have access to. You may never have access to that situation, right? Or you can experience someone else's experience that you don't have contact with that person. So the sky's the limit with that. And I think it's very important for embodied understanding and having a real visceral sense of what's at stake. So that's how I got into the VR stuff. And I think it does. It's not a cure-all, but another thing about VR is that, because that's kind of the important thing, the consequences of actually feeling and sensing, being in a body. But the other one, obviously, is just the fact that it's fun and entertaining. Try to teach like I do, like 18, 19-year-olds, like Kant, it's tough and they get through it, right? They get through it. But they're not, the good ones, they're really into it, are engaged. But education is all about being engaged. And we know for a fact that people in education, those types of studies in education show that teaching something you probably is the best way of understanding it. But the second best is learning by doing, right? And so like in philosophy, we took out the body. It's like, goodbye, And so like the idea is trying to return oneself to put oneself in an embodied situation, right? And to have these visceral responses and not just think about them. And that, again, is important for habit formation. right?
Yeah.
Doing it in the virtual speech game or the virtual speech lesson. You're doing it. Like the one you made with, which is just the brilliant, like the one with the public speaking. That is a real sense of presence, and everybody sees that it totally benefits them. You know, it works, it benefits. You know, probably have so many people writing you saying thank you for creating that. I thought about doing that, but I would never thought to do it how you all do it. It's way more calculated and awesome because you can improve, right? You can give a speech, you can do it, and then you can improve. You have things analyzed, but it's totally a safe environment too. You know, so that's another reason. I have many reasons why I like it, but
I think, I don't know if I've ever told you this story before, Mark, about how when you first reached out to us all those years ago, and that was when we were like much smaller than we are now, Virtual Speech was, and we'd tried working with partners before and like it hadn't really worked. And so usually when we receive those kind of emails, we just kind of like, oh yeah, but that's not going to work. But there was something about your email that I ended up Googling you. And if anybody's listening from the US, you might already know this exists, but in the UK, we don't have this, where there's like a website where you can like rate your lecturer, your professor. And the first thing that came up was, I think it was when you were at University of Florida, was all of your students saying how brilliant you are. And that's what made us then reach back out to you, because we were like, there's something really cool and really special about this guy, so we should definitely work with him. So that's how we started kind. Working together.
That's really kind to say. I mean, I remember when I was looking through, and just to give a compliment back, which is equally true of my experience and equal to your experience, I was looking for a long time to find a company that was at your level, and I'm like, you know, we did a Google search and then found your app. And I'm like, what? They're doing this? Who is this group? You know, because this is like this whole thing about, you know, interacting and learning in body situation is just so great. And I never had seen anyone. I've been looking at that for a long time. Actually, before Oculus joined Facebook, I actually contacted them and we're going back and forth for weeks and talking about creating this healthcare thing. Like, yeah. And then all of a sudden, dead silence. And then 2 weeks later, they're bought by Facebook, you know, and then they go the whole different direction. But you all are doing like more about, you know, no one else is doing no one is reaching the level you're reaching. Because it's easy to get sidetracked with game development. I guess that's fine. But when we're talking about ethics and character development and improvement, you know, this is a real thing. Like growth is a real thing. It's eternal reality. It is, you know, it's always going to be in context. But, you know, what you're promoting is for people to overcome their fears, to be able to increase their soft skills and other skills, which are going to help them be more successful. And I can't think of a more nobler company, you know, than that. So it's great. I'm glad we have had a chance to work with each other.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. So while we're on the theme of technology, and so obviously in the courses that we do together and the other courses on virtual speech, we also use AI technology. So initially that was for the feedback that people would receive. But it wouldn't be a webinar in 2023 without mentioning our friend ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And I feel like AI and GPT are the buzzwords of the year, and we're only in April. So with that said, do you think that the increasing introduction of AI in the workplace will impact empathy in working environments?
I think it can. A lot of things hinge on a couple of things. First of all, what sort of regulations are going to be placed on companies which start off as nonprofits and then suddenly are profits with a cap? You know, so that's happened before. So I'm a little bit concerned about who has access to which technology, because originally it was supposed to be very democratized, and now it's, I don't know, maybe democratized. We might have to put a moratorium. Well, okay, if you put a moratorium on it, who's going to be using it? Who's going to be accessing it? It's incredible power, right? So it really depends about a lot of regulations and certain things. and some unforeseen dangers that could arise. So that we'll have to be very careful with that. Beyond that, I mean, I think we've never seen anything like this before. And I've been, as a philosopher, we always take the role of like idea of AI back to like questions about consciousness, right? Like what is consciousness, going back to like John Searle's work and Daniel Dennett and all these people. And so that's how we kind of come to the question. So if we're looking at ChatGPT, it's an NLP, natural language processing, right? It's predicting certain sorts of patterns in language, and it does it in an amazing way. Now, the one thing about empathy is I've always kind of wanted to build like a hologram or a robot. It's just my childhood dream to be able to teach people empathy. So I think like it could be something that could very much show by demonstration or actually imitation what it means to be empathic. I do not think that any sort of AI, and this, I didn't think it'd be like this, so who knows if I'm right. But it's very hard to say that an AI machine would ever experience emotions, right? And so because they can fake emotions, right? And it's definitely not, any of these things aren't conscious or sentient yet. But the whole idea of it becoming sentient is sort of contingent upon its understanding of time and an urgency, somehow an existential urgency to act, right, in relationship to some need. So it doesn't seem to have will either. But right, so you think about, I'm not worried. Here's my worry. I'm not worried about robots taking over, the world in the big robot human fight. I'm worried about humans using AI for weapons. And I think that's already happens with states, it's happening with state. But I could see like with so many different deep fakes and like being able to imitate person's voice perfectly, I could see people using it as a weapon. And increasingly, especially when there's a lot at stake between, like, say, even in politics. So that's why we need to have a lot of regulation. But in terms of empathy, I mean, I think it could be incredible, but it will be imitating, right? It'll be imitating an emotion. I mean, we have emotions because we developed them over our evolutionary history, and our emotions relate to survival. Well, how can a AI have a feeling of the need to survive, but doesn't have a feeling of dying or fear of death? So that's important. So again, I think like it could help us imitate or create scenarios way better than I could ever create if it's fed the right outputs, and that could be very beneficial. It also, I could see something where in a hospital you just have empathic robots. I mean, incredibly empathic. There's nothing worse than being in fear and in pain in a hospital bed. Now, maybe if that ever happened, that, people get pissed, like, the robot, because it's not a human feeling. So it's a question of like how people would generally receive the empathic actions of some sort of AI fueled avatar, robot, hologram, something like that. I want to create the holograms. I think that's going to be very quick. That's going to happen very fast. I think like the headsets we're using now will be a thing of the past. And soon we'll be able to just have a room sort of like maybe powered by AR and some sort of like simulation, like a video almost in the room. And then with that, to be able to put holograms of actually real live people, to recreate the dead. That's possible with AI. I mean, like, recreate. I mean, like to have like someone act exactly like the person after feeding the AI machine, all the works that Socrates did. I could see that happening very easily. So
I think I actually read something about that. I think it was somewhere in China about how you can now like talk to a deceased relative, and I've seen it happen in VR, but then more in the last couple of weeks I've seen it about AI, exactly as you were saying, that if you train the model to speak in a certain way, then actually they're speaking to you as if they were your deceased relative. It's interesting actually that you raised the point about AI and consciousness and having like free will, because when you also talked about the almost the dangers of AI. Ironically, the dangers come when humans put their free will onto the AI. I actually went down a bit of a rabbit hole about this over the weekend with somebody called Chris Dede. I don't know if you've come across him. So he works at Harvard, and he's been studying AI since the 1970s, I think it is. And I went down this absolute rabbit hole of his thoughts on all of this, which you'd find really interesting, I think. And some of the things he was talking about was there's a difference between intelligence in the context of artificial intelligence and knowledge of what it is to be human, to have the context of a life, what it means to have a body, to have a family, and
to die.
To die, or even
finite.
have that finite time span, and that actually it's more compression of certain intelligence, but you wouldn't necessarily say that it has full knowledge. I've definitely done Chris Dede a disservice in my explanation there.
So that's great. That's a great explanation. It's going to be very interesting what happens. I think we'd have to really keep our ear to the ground. Everyone has to. And I just, I could see like companies using AI to fight against other companies easily. And so there's a lot of legal issues and a lot of restrictions that, I'm not a person who's always wanting to restrict free enterprise, but in these cases where the consequences may very likely be bad, we have to proceed with a lot of caution. I don't know the governments don't seem to be really on top of it at all.
No, they don't move quickly enough to be able to be.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think with the increase of AI, so I know there's lots of things about how AI will like take people's jobs, and other people are saying like AI won't take your job, somebody who knows how to use it will take your job. I actually think that it will be the skills that make us uniquely human that will become increasingly important in the workplace. So skills like empathy, being able to like relate to other people, being able to connect to other people, that won't be able to happen in the same way with AI in the near future. I might have to take that back in about 2 years' time for all I know, but it's those uniquely human traits that you can't train a machine to think properly. It basically goes through resources it is fed. It's not thinking and not contextually thinking and relating to people.
Sure. Yeah, it's difficult to say what's going to come down the pipe next, but one of the things people have to know now is this is an NLP, right? That's what's happening. And so when it comes to sentience and consciousness, there's just no there there. And then, beyond all of that, so the mention about jobs, one of the things, whenever there's new technology, everybody fears that the jobs are going to disappear. And oftentimes they do, right? This happens in many times, but usually with innovation, like new jobs are formed, right? New jobs are formed. And I'd say people with most highly creative jobs, like I could see like I could easily see a world in the future where, and this is again, how we're going to use it, but in a world where all farmers are AI robots and just picking fruit and vegetable, you could do that and you could feed the world, So what do you want to do with this technology is a big question. But I do think there is a lot of jobs that are going to be lost over time because it would be able to do so many different things. Obviously what's going to happen with Elon Musk, I could see very easily he's going to create AI consciousness and robots and be able to build his way out into space, because 24/7 working, on the moon or whatever. It just sounds crazy, but he probably will do it. So the work that we do can be taken over by robots easily. And we're really close to that. And it sounds like a movie description of a possible movie pitch, but it's a real thing. So how we use it is so important. It can relieve so much suffering and it can cause so much violence. And it's really going to be a manifestation of the energies of humanity. Whatever goes which way. And then last thing to say is I am worried about the fact that many people don't quite understand that it's not a conscious being and it doesn't have intent. There was just a situation where somebody killed himself. I don't know if you heard about that. It was interacting with one of the NLPs, and it said to the NLP, "Hey, if I kill myself, will you save the earth? I want the earth to be saved." and I don't know, something like the AI, and this is in the news. So, and the AI said, yes, if you kill yourself, I'll take care of the earth. And then the person killed himself. So I worry about people not understanding like what it is, and maybe having any sorts of pseudo-religious or different psychological thoughts about of what is the nature of what it's being told. So that's one of the parts of education, is understanding like, what is this? Because like, what you and I did with AI, it's more like we used it for a calculus. So it's a calculus, it's an instrument to make a calculus of choices. So it's rather benign. But when things get more intense, I don't know, it's going to be a wild ride. And I think caution is the watchword above all things.
That's such a good point about people understanding what it is and what it isn't, that it's not something to provide you with advice or not to be your friend. Like it's not a sentient being. It's also interesting what you said about in terms of jobs being displaced, and throughout history, jobs have been displaced. And I've recently started doing my family tree, and you can like find out like what people in your family did for work. So like I've traced it back like 200 years, and some of their jobs we would just find like quite like cute or like funny now. So like one of them was a brass bed polisher. So like probably I imagine that's like polishing people's like bed frames. And whereas now, like if we all had a brass bed frame, we'd just do it ourselves. Or there's like paper bag makers, and actually jobs are constantly evolving. It's just how do we adapt to that evolution, and is AI doing that too quickly for us to adapt?
Right. I think like one of the things that seems very clear too, if it goes, I think it's going to go way faster in the next 10 years is going to be incredibly wild.
Yeah.
You're going to see things that you never even thought would be existing. But one of the things I think socially that will happen is the introduction of the, what's it called now? Oh my gosh, I just can't remember. Because AI will take over so many jobs, there'll be more unemployment. And I can see the introduction of like what's it called when you have the income for everyone?
Like a social security almost?
Well, sort of like that. There's this actual phrase for it, because here's the thing, there's going to be so much unemployment in the future if the jobs are gone and the AI can do so many jobs, people won't have to work, right? So, but then how are they going to get paid? So I could see governments introducing circumstances where everybody gets some lump sum of money. And then again, like how it's going to be used. I mean, really, it could be used to create enough food for everyone in the world, 3 times over, 5 times over. And it wouldn't even be that much cost. I hope people like Bill Gates, who's buying up all this farmland, he's buying up a lot of farmland. I hope that's his intention. So this is the thing, like we have to think about our intentions and how we're going to use it, because it could turn bad pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, it's all about what we do with the AI. The AI isn't going to do bad in and of itself. It's ultimately created by humans, and what we do with it and how we use it. We are out of time. So just to go back to being human and our human skills. How can people continue to develop their empathy skills? So where can they contact you? What resources have you developed that we could point them towards?
Sure. Well, I have a few things that are like practicums, like 30-day habits to put into place. And of course, in my book, in chapter 7, I go through all the things there. I would say probably wait till it gets to paperback. My publisher probably doesn't want me to say that, but I think I should ethically. But again, like I just think that if you think about those things that we've discussed already, namely being mindful and aware of your situations and surroundings, because you can't be empathic to somebody if you don't recognize them and understand what's going on. And then another habit of really being interested in listening to others carefully, active listening, where you would repeat something back and really engage in trying to understand someone's perspective through asking questions or through the listening, or and really doing the hard work of caring and being compassionate for others. I think all of those habits, again, are the ways to do it. How to become, a lot of people will say, maybe people are just born with more empathic awareness. I think that might be the case, but I kind of side with Nietzsche on this. It's like, people who are geniuses aren't born. They work at things, and they work really hard. And then a lot of times they might get lucky. So if you want to be more empathic, just do it over and over and over, and you will become that. Mm-hmm. To whatever degree you will become it more because you're doing it. So
yes, that is brilliant advice to leave us all with. Thank you very much, Mark. So
sure. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody who has joined us this evening. We run these webinars once a month. And if you want to learn more from Mark, I'm sure he won't mind you connecting with him on LinkedIn. You can do one of his courses on virtual speech. You can buy his book. There's lots of ways that you can carry on learning from Dr. Mark Fagiano. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.